McKinsey is one of our close partners from the beginning of Techonomy, and James himself is also a close partner of ours from the beginning of Techonomy. We'll talk about some new research that they've been doing about what digitization is doing to companies and to jobs, and then he will retire briefly. I'll be up here with Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker. I'll interview her. Then she will stay on stage. James will rejoin us along with John Chambers from Cisco and Jeroen Tas of Philips Healthcare Informatics. It's going to be really interesting. I can tell you they have a lot of strong opinions. James, please come out and let's see what you have to say.
Thank you, David. We've had about 50 or 60 years of what you might call the digital technology revolution. But digitization, I think, as most of us think about it in ways that we can recognize, has really been with us probably for about the last 25 years. If we go back to about 1990, that's when we see computers that we can recognize, the internet as we know it today. That's when we've used it a lot. We thought it'd be quite helpful to take stock at this stage to see how far along have we come with digitization. And I think in a word, at least in a sentence, the observation you come to is that, in fact, it's no longer a conversation about the haves and the have-nots. It's now a discussion about the haves and the have-mores. It's no longer about the have-nots because all of us have digital technologies. Almost everybody has access to digital technologies. Every company purchases digital technologies. But the real difference is what the ones, some of us are doing more with it than others. So we undertook some time to take a look at all of this. This picture needs no explanation for people in this room. We're digitizing everything ourselves, our homes, our places of work and play, how we go to work and play. But I think what's going to be quite interesting, as we all have talked about, is that over the next few years, we're going to digitize the economy in ways that may not even involve us when we think about the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, automation, and so forth. The question is, while we can all think about the leading companies, the leading technologies, the amazing use cases that are on the cutting edge, the question is, what's happening to the rest of the economy? Is the rest of the economy coming along with us and with this revolution? Well, let's start at the beginning. If you think about how big our industry, our sector, the information communication technology sector is in the economy, it's about 5% of GDP. So it's a small piece, but it's an important piece. If you adjust for the fact that technologies are becoming progressively cheaper, there's a price effect, in fact, that benefits the economy, that size of that impact doubles to about 10% of GDP. But we all know that we're touching many, 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 many more things in ways that perhaps are harder to imagine. And depending on how you look at it, we touch now as much as 98% of the economy through various measures, whether you look at the fact that every company buys information technology, we all access the internet to a greater or lesser extent. There's all these different ways that we're touching, that this industry touches the economy. So what we wanted to do is to really understand how deep, in a very data-driven sense, is in fact digitization. We thought we would actually look at it from three data-driven perspectives. One is to look at the assets. So the asset look takes into account how much IT stock is there inside companies, inside sectors, how much data are companies collecting and now have in terms of the data that companies collect. What is the annual spend, if you like, that different sectors have on information technology? That's the asset view. The usage view takes into account how different sectors and companies are actually using digital technologies. So this ranges from how much of transactions are paid for through digitally enabled means, electronic payments and so forth, how much customer interaction happens digitally, whether it's customers looking at websites, looking for information on products, how much, for example, are business processes being automated by sector. So there's several measures you can think of under usage. Similarly on labor. The labor look takes into account how much are we automating jobs, how much are we creating new digital jobs that perhaps didn't exist before, how much are we empowering workers with what economists call capital deepening to empower them with technologies around all the things that we carry with us that we get to work with. So we took a comprehensive view that takes about 25 or so indices to look at how this looks across the economy and how it's changed over time. So what I'm about to show you are just some summary results for that. If you look at across at least a subset of the sectors here, no surprise at some level on a relative scale, our industry is in fact the most digitized. If you think about all the different factors that I talked about. And in some ways, no surprise, you've got sectors like construction and hospitality much lower down. But what's interesting is if you look at the sub-elements of these indices, one picture that emerges is that even sectors that we don't think of as being very digitized, like, say, government, they've actually bought a lot of information technology. So the asset view says there's a lot of information technology out there that most of these sectors have actually bought. So you start to get a very nuanced picture. And the reason why that's important is because some of these sectors are very large sectors in the economy. So if you take government, for example, it's a public sector, it makes up about 16% of GDP, employs close to 15% of the workforce. Its productivity is not very high. While we all love our own sector, the good news is that it's 5% of GDP. It doesn't employ that many people, only 3%, but the productivity growth is spectacular. So I think that this raises the question about, while we may think we've digitized much of the economy, there's still huge swaths of the economy that have not as fully digitized and are not as productive as they should be. You may also be interested to notice, however, that there are some sectors with the green dots, like hospitality. That is intended to show that we see some spectacular examples of digitization, whether you think about the Airbnbs and so forth, but in a sector that is relatively undigitized.
The time is 9:19.
An example of digital technologies, I suppose. But here's the point about the haves and the have-mores. What we see over time is that, in fact, while most sectors have digitized, there's a widening gap between both the companies and the sectors that are at the frontier of digitization. The dark circles in these balls indicate how the whole economy is digitizing. So it's progressively getting more digital. But what you see is a widening gap. What the outer circle shows, the orange, that shows what the companies and the sectors that are at the frontier are doing. They're digitizing at a far, far faster rate over time than everybody else. And you see this whether you look at if you take an asset view of it, you'll see that the ones in the orange who are the more digitized are more spectacularly digitized. Similarly, the gap is even wider when it comes to usage. And you see a similar view when you look at what's happening to the labor part of this. So this is the point about the fact that while everybody has it, the gaps between the haves and the have-mores are actually widening. The reason why this matters is because when you look at what happens as a result of this, first of all, the companies and the sectors that are more digitized do better. They introduce new products much faster, their productivity is much higher. You can actually see it, for example, in the kinds of things that they do with their customers. They engage their customers more deeply. And they also are the ones who are typically at the forefront of defining the future for everybody in terms of either disrupting not just their own sectors, but other sectors as well, often beyond the constraints of their own sector. So this actually matters when you look at the actual performance and the outcomes, that some companies are starting to do a lot more with digitization than those who've just simply bought it. And we're not done with this revolution, and this is why. So the frontier for digitization is not standing still. There's a whole raft of technologies that are still coming. And what's interesting with all these technologies is that most of them involve digital technologies in one form or another, either in enabling them or in how they get scaled or how they get to consumers ultimately. And it also matters at the economy level. We know that digitization actually drives productivity. And if you look across the economy, the next decade alone, we can fully expect digitization through what it does to productivity to add as much as $2 trillion to national GDP, which is a really big deal at a time when growth is pretty important for the economy. One word on automation, which has been a topic on most people's minds. We've just done, as part of this work, a very deep look through something like 2,000 work activities, as well as about 800 different job categories to see what's happening with automation. And one thing that we find is that at the activity level, something like 45% of tasks that people do could be automated. But that only translates to about 5% of whole jobs. So we're not as concerned with some of the spectacular claims that have been made about automation, at least in the near term, because while lots and lots of tasks will be automated, it doesn't look like they'll automate whole jobs quite as much. However, having said that, we also find that something like 30% of tasks in about 60% of the jobs will actually be automated. So what that means is that what you're likely going to see is a redefinition of what the jobs actually look like, much more so than whole-scale automation. It's a bit like what happened with when ATMs were introduced. The job of the teller didn't go away. It just changed quite dramatically because some portions of that had been automated. Having said that, though, even though I said that only 5% of the jobs would be automated, the biggest impact of that will actually happen in the middle-skilled jobs, where the rates of automation in the middle-skilled jobs will be more like 15 to 20%. And that's actually quite important to keep in mind because that's a faster rate of automation of middle-skilled jobs than we've seen for several decades. For a long time, the rate of automation for those jobs was at the rate of about 8 or 10%. That's an acceleration. So there is something to be concerned about when it comes to middle-skilled jobs. Let me just wrap with some implications from all of this. I think for the point of view of companies, our view is that there's no opting out of digitization. It's no longer a choice about whether you're in or you're out. It's also important to know where the frontier is and the fact that that frontier is actually moving. So it's not going to wait for you. It's constantly evolving. And I think as we see the gap widening between the haves and the have-mores, it's important to keep up with that. And simply having bought IT is no longer enough to differentiate you. And I think the last point here is pretty important, which is with digitization, it's important to recognize it makes it possible for companies, for a whole range of new competitors to enter the fray. Not just people in your sector, but people outside of your sector who use digital capabilities and platforms to participate and disrupt your sector. There's several points to be made for governments as well. One is the fact that it is important that governments embrace digital, not only because it's good for growth, it's good for productivity, and it's good for helping to address many societal issues. Similarly, it's important for governments to think about how to ease the transition, particularly some of the issues that affect jobs and employment as we go through these dislocations that I described. But it's also important for governments to recognize that they shouldn't kill the goose in the sense that it's quite easy for policymakers to get in the way of progress and the kinds of innovations that people in this room work on every day. And it also has an implication, which is, as opposed to policymakers pretending that they actually know how to forward prescribe policy, this technology is moving so quickly. I think a mindset that is more about adaptation and learning on the part of policymakers is a much better way to address these things than simply pretending to know ahead of time exactly how to create policy. And then finally, for individuals, the key message is it's a wonderful time to be a consumer in the use of technology, mostly because we get a lot of mostly free products, cheap products, something that economists call consumer surplus, things that are transforming our lives and make it a lot easier. But I think from the point of view of us as workers and people participating in the economy, it's important to recognize that we're going to have to embrace the idea that our jobs are going to change, and we're going to have to constantly be skilling and reskilling ourselves. And almost, I think as my friend Reid Hoffman said, think of work as entrepreneurship. Something that we actually have to work at in quite some new ways. And then finally, there's a whole set of tools and assets that we can take advantage of as we learn how to navigate this. I'll stop at this point, and we'll have a